Hello and welcome to the Distance podcast, brought to you by the Institute for Liberal Values. This is where we talk about how we could strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. In this week's podcast, Mike Burke meets with Matt Gertken, who is the Chief Strategist for BCA Research, a leading independent provider of global investment research. We discuss the economic problems of the CCP, the potential for its collapse, changes in the Chinese leadership, and the future of the Taiwan Strait. Okay, hello, I'm here with Matt Gertken. I'm not mispronouncing that, am I hope?
No, you got it right.
Very good. Never know with all of these funny American names. And
It's a German name.
Well, of course, but everything becomes American, right? Becomes
That's
anglicized, and so God knows. But yeah, you Americans are very reminiscent. You remember where your origins are, whereas us English often don't have a clue. Okay, so we're here to discuss China and the Communist Party of China and what is going on in China right now, which I think is really important because we're hearing a lot of what is happening in Russia and Ukraine. You know, Russia being one of the principal enemies of liberal democracy. I think it's fair to say, both historically and presently under Putin. You know, it's obvious why we're hearing that because of the war that's raging. And recently we're hearing stuff about Korea as well because of all the drama that has recently unfolded there. But connected to both of those environments and also connected to the conflict that's evolving between Iran, Israel, something big might be about to happen there. Behind all of those conflicts is, to an extent, the Communist Party of China. And would you agree that there's a kind of turmoil that's going on within China right now, connected to the Communist Party and connected to the economy, that doesn't seem to be talked about as much, but is of vital importance? I mean, what would you say to that?
Actually, it's a really interesting premise, Mike, and let me say off the bat, thank you for having me.
Pleasure's all mine.
Well, look, my approach is geopolitics, and geopolitics is structural. We're always looking at sort of the population and the economic structure or foundations of a country. We're always trying to look at nation states as a whole and the ways that they behave. We tend to take a very good look at those long-term factors and then sort of the cyclical factors before we discuss the tactical maneuvering.
Right.
And the tactical maneuvering, which can be rhetoric, it can be ideology, it can also be, sort of political hijinks among individuals and their personalities. Those things are important, and especially in critical junctures, they can be all important. So I would never deny the relevance of an individual or of a personnel reshuffle, a cabinet reshuffle, or those things. But I do think we should, to lay the groundwork, we should say that, yes, it does seem as if there is some turmoil in the political sphere in China, but we have to sort of recognize that, first of all, that's normal. You know, China has a long history of autocratic rule or, strongman rule. And that always creates a dynamic in which favoritism and patronage networks are created. And then that means that there's not like a clear criteria for promotion. Now, rivaling that is that China has a very long and an important history of meritocracy stemming from, the academic system effectively. So it's not as if it's just all been power struggle, but the tension that exists between the sort of meritocracy and the bureaucracy and the more raw power politics, that tension is being resolved under Xi Jinping in favor of power politics. So the most classic example is that they had tentatively been forming a let's say a system of term limits that were unofficial, but maybe could have allowed for smoother transitions between leaders. Xi Jinping, this was never really done, but it was widely discussed, and it sort of tentatively took shape when Hu Jintao stepped down. Xi Jinping just totally threw that out the window, and so what it means is that everyone will always be nervous about what happens if he gets sick and dies, or if something else happens to him. There's just no way of preventing a Gang of Four scenario like happened in the late 1970s when Mao died.
I
So,
mean,
in other words, we're just stuck with this. And so, even though I think it's really interesting what's been happening lately, especially in the military ranks, the top brass,
right.
we should just begin by acknowledging that there isn't really a formal system here. They are kind of winging it.
I think people thought there was a formal system, and it looked like there might have been some kind of, not formal, but how can I say, not entirely informal system prior to subsequent to the reforms of Deng. And then, the Jiang Zemin faction, the Shanghai group or clique as they were called. And then you had the rise of Hu Jintao and the Communist Youth League. And what you had was this gradual but not insignificant drift towards liberalism. I mean, I know that the Tiananmen Square thing happened under Deng. But nevertheless, the economic liberalization was quite significant, and it seemed to be going on and on and on. Certainly, it was very much the case when I was there in China in about 2001 under Hu Jintao, and I thought that it was just going to carry on forever, and it just stopped. I mean, could you say something about the kind of balance of powers that we had, like the princeling factions, for example, and what they were and how they operated?
Yeah, there was a belief that China had formed a balance of power. And I think we have to sort of, even to use that term, we have to recognize, on one hand, the Communist Party officially eschews the notion of separation of powers as a liberal ideology. But on the other hand, everyone who has read aspects of Chinese history knows that balancing is just part of human nature and social, part of society and part of political experience. You can't really get rid of it in any society. So they practice balancing, but they've not had a formal separation of powers or balance of power in the way that that we think of when we think of the Glorious Revolution in the UK or the American Revolution or like Montesquieu's philosophy in France. So anyway, under the latest 2-3 decades, basically after Tiananmen and after emerging out of the sort of darkness of Tiananmen, there was an attempt to put together a system. Deng Xiaoping was managing it, so it was actually a strong man trying to set up. He was a lawgiver, basically trying to say, well, here's going to be the law from now on, and if you children abide by this, then you'll actually have a steady state that you can operate in, and then in that way you can be prosperous and you can start to catch up with the West and you can start to reclaim China's former glory. And it was a brilliant plan, and I think a lot of people give credit to Deng for trying to set that up. The issue is that then when we get into basic, and then that was ruled effectively, Jiang Zemin, as you mentioned, had a Shanghai clique, and they were in power, and they were promoting their acolytes all the way through not only 2002 when Hu Jintao took power, and it's famous that Jiang Zemin didn't immediately cede control of the military until 2004, but then even under Hu Jintao, the Shanghai faction was actually doing quite well in terms of promotions. And in fact, when Xi Jinping took power at the 18th National Party Congress, the Shanghai faction was probably at its peak. And he himself had ties with this faction, and having especially formed his network in Fujian and Zhejiang provinces. So he was viewed by some people as someone who would be either part of the Shanghai faction or sympathetic with the Shanghai faction. Jiang Zemin had put him in place.
Mm-hmm.
But he was also said to belong, and you mentioned this, to the princelings, because his father, Shi Zhongkun, had been an important player in the revolution. Well, what was interesting about that is that the princelings don't have any real identity. Like, for example, even though Xi Jinping was a princeling, the hallmark episode in the 2012 transition of power was the removal of Bo Xilai in Chongqing and his imprisonment, and he was a princeling. So in other words, you can't say the princelings are all allied with each other. In fact, what was constitutive of that event, of that power transition, was a conflict between the princelings. And Wang Qishan came in and was basically friends with Xi Jinping and his top operator, and oversaw the very important anti-corruption crackdown that helped to consolidate power within the party and consolidate power within the country around Xi Jinping. He was a princeling, but some of the other princelings were Shanghai guys, and ended up getting cracked down on and removed, including some top military leaders, where the princelings are still quite powerful. So I guess I'll conclude by saying the princelings are an important element, but I don't think they have ideological conformity. I don't think they have coherence in terms of their networks of patronage. And what's really interesting is that even the other factions, like the Shanghai faction or the Communist Youth League, which we'll talk about later, I'm sure, those factions also are not really very coherent, and they've wilted under Xi Jinping. So this is a tumultuous political environment, and it's one that really factions operate, but it's very hard to draw the lines between them, and it's very, very hard to show how they impact policy.
And it's very poorly understood, the Chinese system. And I guess when I try and explain it to people, I mean, you can tell me what you think of this analogy. I kind of try and I think many Chinese people, a lot of the Chinese people that I've talked to, a lot of the Chinese analysts that I've talked to, tend to regard the Communist Party as a kind of red dynasty. Like that as if they're another iteration of one of the big imperial Chinese dynasties. And like within the Chinese dynasties, there seems to be these factions that are forming and competing with each other. But that seemed to work up until a point, didn't it? You know, I mean, there wasn't a balance of power in the sense that there was, or there is within the United States, or the less formal distinction of powers that we have in the UK. But there was this kind of sense that, okay, you will have your go for a while, and then I'll have my go. For example, I mean, you know, Hu Jintao had appointed his successor to Xi Jinping, who was assumed was going to rise to power, and then completely disappeared off the map. I think he's reappeared recently, right? Which is interesting. Would you agree with that as an analogy, or do you think that doesn't work? And if so, what are the extent of it working or not?
Yeah, well, I think you're getting us back on track here on this issue of separation of powers, because what happened is, even though they didn't have the traditional Western notion, there was balancing. And specifically, like you said, leaders would nominate their successor's successor. And that seemed to be like a nascent norm that was taking shape. The other thing is that there was supposed to be a balance on the Politburo and on the Politburo Standing Committee, where the Shanghai faction was sort of roughly equivalent with the Communist Youth League faction. And that held for, less than 20 years, but it seemed like a way of producing an internal tension that would prevent the overwhelming power of one group. The other thing is that, remember also that the bureaucracy had been sort of strengthened over this period, because China was trying to merge with the capitalist international trading system and the post-Soviet world order, and that meant bringing technocrats into play and creating agencies and departments that would be fluent and parallel with the rest of the world's Western democracies and capitalist countries, so that you would have like an important finance minister who could go and make policy on the budget and then talk to other finance ministers. And that state bureaucracy would then run parallel with the Communist Party. And that started to create an idea of a balance of power between the state and the Communist Party. But again, these things were explicitly and forcefully rejected under Xi Jinping. And he fully, I'll stop, but he fully swallowed the state bureaucracy. I mean, that's no longer an issue at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, about 5-6 years ago, talking with friends who are China analysts who are very pro-CCP at the time who would say things like, well, look, okay, there are these human rights violations, but things are getting better, things are going to continue to progress. And one of the things that they pointed to was the bureaucracy, that was something that was very distinctively Chinese, that it was organically Chinese in a way that Mao never was when he tried to purge the four olds and kind of get rid of the old culture. That you saw this kind of re-emergence of an affection for Confucianism, harkening back all the way to the first emperor and the entrance examinations to the imperial bureaucracy, something that then didn't just permeate Chinese culture, but spread to places like Japan, where arguably it's still, in Japan, what we would call the Kanryo over here is still very powerful and it still follows that model. And so there was a lot of optimism that, that kind of thing, that kind of institution would keep leaders in check in a way that, for example, the various organs of state in the United States were able to keep a Donald Trump in check, or at least last time, more or less. What was it that caused them to fail?
So I take a little bit different of a view. Some of what we've talked
Sure.
about already, not from you, but I mean from what I think is probably the consensus history that's now being written about Xi Jinping. And some of the things I've said even might lead someone to think that it all changed when Xi Jinping came to power in 2012 because of Xi Jinping. But actually, I think he was sort of, from his perspective, the right man in the right place in the right time. And from many of the Communist Party's members' perspective, that's probably true. But what I'm saying is that it was a zeitgeist. And specifically, what was happening was that China's extremely rapid growth was revolutionary in its own way. It was unsettling for the society. It was creating exorbitant inequality, exorbitant environmental degradation, corruption, all these factors that were very evident. For example, in 2007, right before the financial crisis, the speed of property development involved thousands of mass incidents where construction teams were basically throwing peasants off their land or bulldozing them, out of their homes. So this whole process was the fastest industrialization ever, and it was revolutionizing the society. But what happened was then the Communist Party started getting torn apart internally. No one ever really even saw it until the Bo Xilai affair. But the group that was still sort of loyal to a notion of a liberalization process, like Wen Jiabao, they still sort of harkened back to Hu Yaobang in the 1980s as a period of potential flowering of some liberal notions, and they thought that would ultimately free up the productive elements of society, so it fit with their overall views on economic liberalism. But they were operating at the same time that you started to see social instability emerge, and then in particular, free flow of information. The internet was revolutionizing the society at the same time, and you can see how you put these things together: a permissive government, a free-flowing information from the internet and coming in from around the world, with extreme inequality and extreme social pressures around health and education and other things. All of this was leading to what could have been an anti-party movement, and it could have been a nationwide anti-party movement. And then to top it all off, then you have the U.S. suffer this financial crisis that then spreads around the entire world and forces the economic model to be changed. So now they're investing in property at home much more than in export manufacturing, because the American consumer is deleveraging and export manufacturing can't really grow as much anymore. So all of that really came to a head in the 2008 to 2012 period. Xi Jinping was already positioned to be the successor, but the Communist Party at that point was basically begging for someone to come in and re-centralize power, revive the party, and crack down on these social elements and party elements that were imagining a different future. And so Xi Jinping fit with the zeitgeist and he fully embraced it. But it was a new change, and it was effectively that time-tried cycle in China of centralization followed by decentralization. What we had was 20 years of decentralization, and then and then the global financial crisis caused a new phase of centralization.
When do you think was the moment that centralization really became kind of crystal clear to the world, or as well as China? So for me, the point of no return was when Hu Jintao was ejected from that famous meeting on live television. I was, we all knew that stuff was happening. We all knew that Xi Jinping was centralizing power, but to be that brazen was quite shocking for me.
Yeah, I would put it a lot earlier than that, but I definitely agree with you that was the sort of undeniable. At that point, it was basically written on China's forehead. That the past had been rejected, and that Xi Jinping had personalized power and attained absolute power. But I think the point of no return came earlier. Well, I remember the process pretty well around the financial crisis. So let me just point out one thing. And
Sure.
obviously, I'm not like endorsing the Wall Street Journal, but they did a really good job, because if you were reading the Wall Street Journal in 2011 and 12, around the time that Xi Jinping came to power, there were two major narratives. One narrative is that Xi Jinping was going to be a free market reformer, leaning in that direction. And that narrative wasn't, it sounds just laughable today. And I didn't agree with it at the time, but it was hard to fight off because Xi Jinping had been sort of, he'd been quarreling with Mao throughout his life. And he had actually defended Hu Yaobang in the 1980s. And then Xi Jinping had risen to power in the context of, like, Zhejiang province having booming companies and rapid growth on the coasts, and so he seemed like he would be pro-market, and this was the story being told everywhere, and it also fit with the zeitgeist in general of the U.S. and China engaging their economies, which still seemed to be operating. But what happened was the financial crisis and a change in the narrative in China. And there were some really serious political scandals and crackdowns brewing. And then the Bo Xilai affair, I think 2011. And then here's the thing, that I noticed that the Wall Street Journal started talking about how Xi Jinping was going to bring back strongman rule. And I think they started doing that probably around 2013, maybe 2012. I don't know. But the rumor was getting out. And I'm sure others had hypothesized this. I'm sure others were observing it, but it was the only mainstream publication at the time that was really paying attention to it. And Xi Jinping had just formed his first government in 2013. And people in 2013 still thought that, like, Li Keqiang as the premier would have, like, influence. They thought he might matter, but they didn't know yet that no one was going to matter except one guy. And anyway, and then finally, the anti-corruption crackdown went nuclear in 2013 and 2014. And so to me, that was sort of the ultimate turning point.
Do you think I'm assuming that you'd agree with me that the economy is in absolute turmoil now and probably long past the point of no return in terms of a major crash. Do you think that was avoidable? A lot of people are trying to blame Xi Jinping for the centralization that is happening and saying that he is responsible for it. But another argument might be that, well, look, the property bubble, for example, or the local government debt bubble would be another one, was just so massive that nobody really could have done anything about it anyway. Where would you stand on that?
Yeah, well, as always, I think it's a little bit of both. He definitely has made mistakes, and I think big ones. But I do, again, with the geopolitical method and a macroeconomic outlook, like, I tend to sort of agree with those who say that he inherited this context, and what that was the massive credit bubble you mentioned to get out of the financial crisis, and all those other things we talked about. He inherited all of that, and here's the thing: what you needed to have a more free market system was to restructure and liquidate a lot of state assets. But when you liquidate labor or when you liquidate state capital, you are causing unemployment. And you're also causing a recession initially, because all this production that's being funded by the state is going to be cut, and you're going to have a big drop in the state contribution to growth. And then those people can't, they don't have jobs, so their income falls, and that means they don't consume as much, and that means that even the private sector doesn't invest as much. So then you really do end up with a recession. Now, if you're in a context like in the 1980s and 90s, where global demand is just booming and global trade is just booming, and all these workers are coming out of the country, and China's booming as they join the assembly line. In that context, you can cut state-owned enterprises. It will slow down the economy, but you won't have a recession. And basically, overall demand can still perform pretty well. And that's exactly what happened when Zhu Rongji did that, from 1997 onward. But once you get into the 2010s, if you went in and slashed all these state-owned enterprises and slashed all this government spending, you would end up with a genuine recession, because global demand was weak. And, you didn't have as much of a tailwind from people coming out of the country, etc. So in other words, Xi Jinping, he got enormous criticism in 2016, specifically because he sort of repudiated all the thinking that he was going to streamline the state enterprises. He said, actually, we're going to make them stronger. Or I guess it was 2017. It was the 19th National Party Congress. He said, actually, we're going to make them stronger. Well, he doubles down on the SOEs. He doubles down on state-led growth. And it was a big disappointment for those who hadn't been paying attention for the previous 5 years. But what it shows us is that his context was different. And in fact, the regime was very well aware that if they did go in and take a, sort of a free market approach, that they were going to have a recession, and that would be threatening for the Communist Party.
I think it's probably at this stage worth pointing out that a recession in China wouldn't look much like a recession in the United Kingdom or the United States. It would be what would a recession, a genuine proper recession, look like in China?
Yeah, well, back then when you had growth rates that ranged in real terms from like 6 to 8%, all that was even discussed was like a growth recession, meaning that growth slowed down, but it didn't turn negative. And in a way, that is what happened. Like in a way, you could say that is what happened, because today we have 4%, maybe 5% growth. And so people can say, well, based on back when they were growing at 8%, that is what happened. We had a growth recession. But the laws of economics and human nature, I don't think change just because we're talking about China. So I think they can have a real recession, like a contraction in growth. I think growth can go negative in China just like it can go negative anywhere else. It's harder with a developing country where you're just adding all these workers and you're adding all this new capital, and so just the the sort of potential GDP growth is very high. It's hard to have a recession in that context. But China today has a shrinking population and a shrinking labor force. So unless productivity is very strong, they actually will have a shrinking economy. And that's different than it was, 10 years ago or 20 years ago.
So we should probably talk about what's happening, so that whoever's listening to this might really understand, because there's still a lot of ignorance around China and how the economy works. So could you say a little bit about the local government debt problem, and then the property bubble, what they've been doing with these buildings of ghost cities and tofu dreg architecture, and then them all falling down and so on and so forth?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a long story, and some listeners will be very familiar with it, others maybe not so much. I think the simplest way to wrap your head around it is that the Chinese households have been big savers, but also the Chinese corporates have been big savers, and the government has deliberately run policies to increase savings. And so over the past 40 years. And by the way, the best person to read on this, you probably know, is Michael Pettis at the
Mhm.
Carnegie Endowment. But the point is that anyone can point out, any economist will point out to you that the level of savings in this economy is enormous. And that notion of savings is like national savings. So it isn't just the households. But the point is that everyone was making money hand over fist because China industrialized and was very efficient and competitive and open up, and the US allowed them to open up to the US market and global markets. And it just created this huge windfall year after year of gigantic trade surpluses. Um, so all that savings, though, was sort of trapped in production, because what would normally happen in countries if they had, if they had a lot of savings, you'd have these, um, you'd have all this production, because that savings can be turned into investment, and then you can build new productive capacity and everything. So now you're running all these trade surpluses, but then what would happen is your currency would rise, because their capital would flow into this country to take advantage of this return on capital, and everyone would be buying your currency, and your currency would appreciate. And then as your currency appreciated, it would force an evening out of, suddenly your exports would become more expensive, and so other countries wouldn't be buying your exports as much. And meanwhile, your imports would be becoming a little bit more attractive, and so your people at home would start shelling out more money to buy foreign goods. And so you'd basically balance the economy. But what China did is that and it wasn't just the currency. I mean, like, obviously President Trump really fixates on the currency, and that is one of the big factors. But there were many macro policies that effectively trapped the savings in China and prevented the rebalancing that would normally occur. And that would involve capital flows in and out of the country, a free floating currency. It would involve allowing companies to go bankrupt, especially state companies. It would allow all these different adjustments. Normally, for example, when you're manufacturing that much stuff, normally what happens is a social movement emerges where people say, well, we want to crack down on pollution, we want to save the environment, we want to give people better labor regulations so that they can protect their physical safety and their families. But none of that existed in China, and so it was just this surge in production, and it created an enormous global imbalance. So that's the sort of really simple version of this. Now, the way it ties into what you were saying, well, as the property sector was developing, and then that really took off after the Great Recession, because now exports and manufacturing aren't growing as much, and so China's sort of pumping money in at home. So all those savings are running out of manufacturing, they're running into property sector. But what happened was the local governments weren't allowed to really do much on their own, like especially they couldn't run deficits, for example. So they needed revenue to offset their spending. And that meant that they would sell land to property developers, and property developers would then go and build a high rise. And this was a really comfortable relationship. It also, in many cases, very corrupt relationship. But the point is that the boom in the property sector was also a boom in local government revenue. And then what happened is when you started to get a surfeit of properties, you started having this problem of revenue drying up and local governments not being able to spend. Now, local governments also were trying to do too much. So they found a way around. They weren't allowed to borrow and run deficits, but they found a way to do that by getting these financing vehicles. And these are sort of like, like shell companies that would borrow and lend on behalf of the local government. And they were speculating in many cases on the rising property price, but they were also just allowing the government to acquire, more assets. But anyway, that led to a huge debt increase. And so then when Xi Jinping came into power, and they start really looking at all this insane credit growth, insane money growth, and insane debt growth, they basically went to the local governments and they said, hey, let me see your books. How much have you actually been borrowing to to develop your area that you're in control of? And nobody knew. It wasn't transparent. So anyway, over the course of the Xi Jinping regime, we went from trying to institute some transparency and recognizing the size of local government debt crisis. But then we wound up with actually a peaking property bubble. So prices start to fall and activity starts to fall. And now they don't have any revenue. So now they're indebted and they don't have revenue. And that's, of course, why we've seen a true, in the 2020s, we've seen a true decline in China's economy, because the local governments don't want to borrow anymore and the property developers don't want to borrow anymore. And in fact, nobody wants to borrow anymore.
And this is leading to social unrest, right? Because you've got people who have paid money for, sometimes quite wealthy, powerful people who have paid money for apartments that aren't going to get built, or apartments that have been built that will never be, that aren't of a living quality, right? In cities that nobody's going to live in. And people being unable to withdraw money from banks is another example of something that's happened recently. So where are we going from now? I mean, I'm at the point, I take the point of view that there is nothing really that Xi Jinping or the Communist Party can do to prevent the collapse. What is that collapse going to look like? I mean, we've spoken to Peter Zane on here before, who says that China won't exist as a country. I'm not sure that's true, because, I mean, again, I would go off the script here with geopolitics. I like him, he's a lovely chap and all the rest of it. But, the Han ethnic ties of, I mean, the Han ethnic ties, I think, are very strong. I can't see famine happening in China. I don't think famine in China is in anybody's interests. Oh, well, okay, yeah. I mean, if you get a very aggressive PLA and somebody puts a destroyer in the Straits of Malacca, and well, you could deindustrialize China that way. And that will kind of bring us on to what I wanted to talk about with the PLA and perhaps the potential softening of their stance with regards to Taiwan, especially. Well, you may disagree with me, but we should do. Where is it going? How bad is it going to go? How bad is it going to get?
Well, let's take well, first of all, Peter Zion was my first boss, and I have enormous respect. So I have enormous respect for his work.
Me too. Yeah.
I think, sometimes he can be hyperbolic about things like that, right? About China ceasing to be a nation. I'm not going to speculate about that. Look, the point is that nations themselves tend to be quite permanent. But he knows as well as anyone knows that China's form changes over time. The time that we live in is a time in which China has been consolidating power over a lot of different territories. They obviously have full control of Manchuria and Inner Mongolia. But in our time alone, they've cracked down and reasserted control over Tibet and Xinjiang and Hong Kong. And they're building the capabilities that they would need in order to reassert control over Taiwan. So, plus they have an extensive economic influence that I think it's often exaggerated. And I also think that the economic outlook is bleak. So they may be losing that influence. But the point is that that discussion hinges on, in a great part, for example, what happens with Taiwan and what happens with the Communist Party. But you can easily envision a situation in which over several decades or over the course of the century, in which the regime falls. That, regimes fall. The American regime could fall. Regimes fall. And especially when you're looking at a country that has these enormous economic imbalances, enormous inequality, and an extremely rigid and centralized and autocratic political party. They actually, and this is where we mentioned briefly earlier that Xi Jinping has made mistakes. And I mean, the biggest mistake was that he took a country that had been developing some resilience and he sort of pulled it back into the old style of rigid centralized command style government. The economy is not entirely command style, but it's more than it was. Anyway, you lose that resilience. You start to become brittle. You're so rigid, you start to become brittle. And I mean, I think it's like a Chinese saying that a young flexible tree bends with the wind, whereas an old rigid tree breaks in the wind. And so that's a really important consideration, that you can have a party split. Certainly, you can have a regime fall. You can have a dynastic failure. And COVID-19, actually several Chinese regimes or dynasties have fallen because of disease and epidemics. In this one, of course, they didn't, and I didn't think they would, but it was a risk, and certainly it hurt the regime. So anyway, those are all interesting speculations, but it's also, none of us can see the future, and if we try to predict the future even a little bit, we're often way off. So anyway, we have to have some humility there as well. Like, China is also ethnically homogenous, right? So it's 90% Han Chinese. Well, that's about as like any ethnic core, long-lived ethnic group in the world is an almost indestructible unit. So talking about the failure of nations, that discussion has to do with economics. It has to do with the particular political structures, but ethnic groups are like it's like the periodic table of humanity.
Right.
I mean, these are elements. They're not going anywhere.
Full on bedrock,
okay.
if you like.
Yeah, exactly. So I think when we get to the part of the discussion, well, where is this all headed? Well, we just have to, again, let's take a scorecard of what we've talked about. We've talked about a regime that reverted to autocratic government, a regime that the economic model expired and shifted to an investment-driven model, but then that property and investment and that expired as well. So there is no economic model. Xi Jinping has some ideas, he's investing very heavily in the military and technology and research and development, but there's no ability for research and development, for example, to take the place of the 50% of investment that was coming from manufacturing and infrastructure and property. So they're banking on making a great leap forward where these technological investments suddenly produce truly breakthrough technologies and general purpose technologies, renewable energy and artificial intelligence, and that could happen, but it's also sort of like Deus ex machina, like we're going to hit on a brilliant technological solution that'll be a panacea and it'll solve everything and then we'll all be fine. But if that doesn't happen, then you're still stuck with debt deflation and social unrest. And so to answer your question, social unrest is bubbling up. It's not like these are all people who are brainwashed by Western ideology and they want to overthrow China's regime so that they can impose a Western style. That's not at all the case. Western style democracy. But of course I often hear people say that to me. But what I'm saying is, look, I don't care what you call it. The point is that the population is going to suffer slower income growth and ultimately even negative income growth. And that population becomes unhappy. And we've seen this. I mean, even during COVID, we actually saw nationwide, cross-region, cross-segment, anti-system, anti-political system protests. So it can happen in China just like it can happen anywhere else. I think social unrest is the short answer to the question. The regime is confident that they can handle that because it's a dictatorship and they have a military control. But over a long enough period of time, what do you end up with? You end up with a split in the party because one side of the party says we have to change the direction economically. Otherwise, the social unrest will simply get worse. The other faction says no, we can just crack down on it interminably, like the North Korean faction basically says we can just permanently suppress everyone, and that's probably going to lead to a break in the party at some point.
And that's probably going to lead to the next point in the conversation too. Are we there right now? A lot of people are suggesting that, well, for example, over the years, Xi has purged pretty much everybody who was disloyal to him, well, in the party in general, but particularly within the military. And now we're starting to see a rival of his, a former rival of his, and some people are saying he's no longer a rival, Zhang Youxia, accrue more and more power. And while former Xi loyalists, people who have been raised up through the ranks specifically by Xi, Miao Hua, famous admiral and head of the political workforce, which is an internal intelligence agency that's tasked with overseeing the loyalty of PLA officers, high-ranking PLA officers, has now been removed and is under investigation for just one of the most recent examples among many. What is going on? I mean, is Xi still in control of the military? Many people are saying he's not.
Yeah, so I think he is. It is important that these are people he promoted, and so it's important that, like, in what was, the mainstream media called it a cabinet of loyalists when the 20th National Party Congress occurred in 2022, and I think really that was pretty much true. I mean, I looked at every individual on the list. I looked at their backgrounds. I mean, they were either promoted by Xi Jinping or they were roughly allied with Xi Jinping. And a lot of the Communist Youth League figures were simply removed. And then, like you said earlier, dramatically, Hu Jintao himself was marched out of the Central Committee. So this was a purge only 2 years ago, and a full consolidation of power. And but we've had a collapsing economy since then because of the property sector, and now Trump's coming in and he's going to impose more tariffs, which is likely to scare more capital away from China, right? So things are getting worse, not better. And so lo and behold, we now have news reports of tensions within the party. But in terms of Xi Jinping's control of the military, the issue there is that it's a very decisive control. And by reshuffling all these people, like I think 3 or 4 commanders of the rocket force, 2 defense ministers, he's gotten rid of the head of the Air Force and and he sacked previously he had sacked a lot of really powerful members who were princelings, who had, extensive networks in the military. So this was, this is all suggesting that he's still very much in control, and that the only way that the military's personnel are chosen is through their loyalty to him. And it would be a very Maoist policy to essentially purge your own followers, or your own loyalists, which is some of what he's doing. So I don't think we can conclude that he's out of power, but we can conclude that the corruption and the poor performance in the People's Liberation Army is starting to reach a level that heads are rolling. And that, in a way, you could read that as a good thing. Like, well, if Russia has ended up spending trillions of US dollars and killing like 150,000 boys in Ukraine, and all they're going to get out of it is the Donbass. And then meanwhile, Xi Jinping is looking at his rocket force, and all they've been doing is embezzling money, and he's not sure whether the rockets are going to work. And he's got his brand new nuclear submarine sinking and things like this.
In Wuhan, yeah.
Yeah, he could end up. This could end up forcing a major recoil, or like a retrenchment, where the regime basically has to go back to the drawing board and delay any plans of conquest. I don't know if they were going to or not, but they have to sort of rethink their strategy. Anyway, and then the last thing is with the question of political supremacy, well, it's still the case that all the organs of the Communist Party are firmly under Xi Jinping's control. So he's got all the dirt on everyone. He controls the security agencies. He I think, in other words, what we're seeing is some kind of refraction of a debate about economic policy, and it's being translated in the Western media as something that could lead to the ouster of Xi Jinping. But I sort of doubt that. So instead, what we're seeing is economic policy debate is heating up to the point that it's actually creating political tensions. But those political tensions will probably be resolved by heads rolling. And then what's the most ironic part of all of it is that after these heads roll and the dissidents or the skeptics or whoever is pushing against Xi Jinping, he'll probably end up adopting what their advice was. Like if they were saying, listen, we've got to negotiate, we've got to transfer some fiscal resources to the households, we've got to try to do a phase 2 trade deal with Trump, if they were trying to draw a little bit more liberal of an economic line in order to rehabilitate the economy, he might cut their heads off and then do exactly what they said, because otherwise he's going to drive the country into a real recession and massive social unrest and a real permanent rift in the party.
So what do you think, finally, because we're going to run out of time very shortly, what do you think China would look like if it attempted to invade Taiwan, which would have to happen in April or October for the seas to be ready? And it's unlikely to happen next year, right? Because we'd see the troop mobilizations from satellite. So the preparation would be able to spot it a mile off, right? What would happen? I mean, I know you're going to say predicting the future is very difficult and it's a fool's errand, if you like. But at the very least, it would be extremely costly and difficult for the Communist Party, both economically and in terms of loss of life. I mean, if you look at the situation of Ukraine, which is former Soviet Union territory that they know very well, with arguably superior military forces than what the Chinese have. Versus the largest amphibious assault, I think, in human history. I think it tops even the Korean War and the Normandy landings, with an entirely untested navy of dubious technological prowess. Let's put it that way. I'm not going to draw you into the conversation on the aircraft carriers that I like to laugh at. Suffice to say, I'm not a fan, and my background is war studies, but I'm not a fan at all of their military technology. What would be the best case scenario and the worst case scenario for the CCP, do you think?
Well, I think you've said it all really well, and this would be.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, really. I mean, this would be sort of taking 40 years of prosperity and dashing it all away by bashing your head against a rocky island that's militarized and allied with the U.S. and Japan. It would be a disastrous policy, and so it would have to come from, I think, 3 broad scenarios. There's probably more, but one is if the Taiwanese themselves had political conditions that led to an extremist, quote unquote, pro-independence movement that actually tried to effectuate independence. And popular referendums are very frightening from that perspective, because they could be successful at someday. Now, the polling shows that they wouldn't be successful today. And in fact, it's been quite consistent that only about a third of people, want to be independent. So it's not really an immediate risk, but the point is that someday those conditions could happen. Because, I mean, think about it. China's economy is going down, their militarism is going up, and the United States is growing somewhat more inclined to, to defend Taiwan, and so it could happen. And I don't say that about Trump, by the way, but we'll come back to that. Anyway, so something could lead to Taiwan moving in the direction of independence. And again, that's just really not very likely. They would know that they would be making themselves ground zero. They would know, every voter in Taiwan would know that they'd be asking to be attacked. So The other option is China falling apart at home, recession, social unrest, division in the Communist Party, and then a war hawk faction rises to the surface saying, we will unify the party, we will unify the nation, and we will reunify the nation by going on this crusade that unites everyone around redressing an historical wrong. And of course, whenever I say that, I get a lot of pushback. People say China's not. They love to say China's not extroverted, or that China doesn't do conquest, or that China's, But the thing is that Taiwan is an exception, even if you accept the notion that China doesn't like conquest historically, which isn't really true if you ask the
No.
Vietnamese. But anyway, even if you accepted that, Taiwan would be an exception because they believe Taiwan is part of China, and it claims to be the rightful ruler of China. So I always make the analogy of the American Civil War. If the Confederates, after losing, had gone to Cuba and set up, base in Cuba, right? And the thing is, that leads us to the third possibility, which is if the Americans tried to transfer a game-changing weapons technology to Taiwan. Just like when the Soviets tried to transfer nuclear weapons to Cuba, the Americans were forced to impose a blockade. And clearly, if the Americans had some technology that we were going to give Taiwan that would really change the military balance, China would just be forced to impose a blockade. And then lastly, I think a blockade is the most, whatever might be the cause, I think a blockade is the most realistic military approach. It would cause a war. It's not a way of saying, oh, this wouldn't be a war. A blockade is a war. It's an act of war, and it would be reacted against as an act of war. It's just that China's more likely to succeed with a blockade style rather than a Normandy invasion style. Either way, they can get it done, probably. It's just that they're going to destroy their economy in the meantime, and they'll be engaged in a proxy war with Japan and the United States, and they'll have a lot of their imports from abroad cut off by the U.S. Navy, and they'll be suffering sanctions and boycotts from all the other democracies as well. So it's just a disastrous scenario, and I don't think it's imminent. I totally agree with you about if it were truly imminent, we'd see the satellites and we'd have warning. The only thing I would say about it to conclude is if we do see that mustering of forces and huge buildup, then we should take it seriously. Like when Putin amassed forces in Ukraine in April of 2021, a lot of people didn't take it seriously. They said he was bluffing all the way up until the moment that he invaded. And so my only point is, I don't think it's very likely, and like in the short run. But if you see the evidence that they're mobilizing the nation, then in fact you should really rapidly upgrade your probability that they're going to do it.
So this is before we move on to Trump and just conclude. This is a really well-known military tactic. It's called creating a new normal. It's what the Egyptians did against the Israelis. I think in the Yom Kippur War. They kept moving their forces up against the Suez Canal, and they'd have them lounging around on the beach, smoking cigarettes and drinking beer and the rest of it. And then they'd move them back, and then they'd move them up again. And the Amman, the military intelligence directorate, was absolutely convinced that it was all for domestic consumption until they attacked, and with much inferior forces that the Israelis had, and arguably delivered the biggest scare Israel has had up until the 7th. And because it was a military attack, some people would even say it was worse than the 7th, because it was a clear existential threat against, and present existential threat against Israel, whereas Hamas breaking through was a few terrorists doing some abominable things. So it is, that is a distinct possibility, and that's exactly what the Russians did in Ukraine. And I think if we are going to see an invasion, we will see that back and forwards, back and forwards, back and forwards, back and forwards. But I don't think it can happen this year because it hasn't started yet. We've seen naval assets and we've seen planes, but again, we'd really need to see boots on the ground for an actual invasion as opposed to a blockade. And then, we're looking at millions of Chinese dead to even get a beachhead, which is questionable whether they can even achieve that.
Right. So I mean, I guess if I could just insert one last thing.
Sure.
I would say over the long run, I'm very concerned about this being a military conflict,
Mm-hmm.
But it's just that we would have to see those signposts that you're discussing, and we'd also have to see a place where China gets that there is no economic future. Like Russia, for example, the economy was a shambles. The sole source of legitimacy was national security, and then Putin started invading countries. China isn't quite at that point yet. The economy is a debacle, but it's still growing at 4 or 5%. We would have to see that basically collapsing such that the only way the Communist Party stays in power is through national security objective.
So we're kind of getting to a Margaret Thatcher Falklands kind of scenario, if you like.
Well, but you know what? I actually push back again. That's an example of sort of a gratuitous. I mean, I not entirely gratuitous. Obviously, the UK had to defend, their territory, but it's just I don't think of it as a distraction. I think of it as a crusade. So, like, yeah, okay, Falklands or like with Reagan invading Grenada. There's always these ones that are like a diversion, where there's some domestic problem, but that's all very petty and short-term stuff. But if you look at the period of the Crusades, Europe as a whole was in chaos. Europe as a whole tried to unite around a grand military adventure. And that does happen in history. And I think that would be some kind of well, that's a bad analogy in many ways. But the point is that a crusade is a grand military attempt stemming from widespread domestic instability. And we have seen that in history, whether it be Germany, whether it be France in the 17th century, or many other Eastern nations.
And we certainly see that in the rhetoric coming out of the Communist Party, who seem to think that reunification is something that's quite sacred, which kind of flies in the face of their kind of atheistic demeanor that they have. They see it as something very spiritual and very, very, very sacred that they need to do. So that brings us on to what I think we should conclude on. Now we have an incoming Trump presidency. All the indications are, although we never know with Trump, right, because he's so unpredictable, all the indications are is that he will continue to build on what he did the last time round, which is really put the screws on China and Xi Jinping. How closer does that bring us to conflict?
In general, the trade war, if it becomes like the intention here, we can gather from the first term, President Trump waged a trade war, but then when the election approached in December of 2019 and January of 2020, he rapidly pivoted, concluded a phase one trade deal because he wanted to repair the economy and allow the manufacturing sector to bounce back prior to the 2020 election. And he didn't know COVID was going to hit at that point, right? So we it's a revealed preference of President Trump's to negotiate a deal and release this pent-up demand. Okay, but it is different this time because he's only a one-term president this time. He can't remove term limits the way that Xi Jinping did. So that means that when we get to 2027, 2028, if Xi Jinping is not offering serious concessions, the Republican Party might be begging President Trump, please do a phase two trade deal. J.D. Vance, the vice president, might be begging President Trump because they're all worried about November 2028. But Trump himself is at that point solving for his historical legacy for hundreds of years, and his legacy is tariff man and the man who took on China. So he may not agree to a phase two trade deal at the end. And Xi Jinping really does have to offer serious structural concessions to get him to do that. Now, if he doesn't, and those tariffs are permanent, and the next president does not remove those tariffs, but doubles down on the same policy, and those are a couple of ifs. But at that point, we now have a case where the American policy is truly infringing on China's economic development and their household stability, their political stability. So it probably does increase the probability of conflict. And I think that's a cautious way of putting it. I mean, I think it would be very easy to say trade war clearly makes it more likely that we have other kinds of war. But I think there is a process here. Trump has to evolve from a negotiator and a sort of deal maker into a trade warrior, like a permanent trade warrior. And then that has to be ratified by the 2028 election. And then at that point, Xi Jinping could become quite a bit more aggressive in the region. And also similarly, the 2028 Taiwan election, if the Kuomintang keeps coming back in 2026 and 2028 so that they gain the presidency in 2028, well, then in that case, China has maybe 4 or 8 years of negotiations and doesn't really have to flex their muscles much. But if we're still seeing Democratic Progressive Party rule Taiwan and the Americans are leveling an open-ended attack on the Chinese way of life, then the odds of conflict definitely go up. And so that's why I worry about 2029, 2030, that time frame. And I worry about that time frame a little more than 2027, which is just the 100th birthday of the PLA, and invading a country is a stupid way to celebrate your 100th birthday. There's no connection there.
Right, and then of course, the final piece of the jigsaw there would be Japan, who are quite rapidly remilitarizing on the sly. Right, they've added themselves 2 quite tiny, nice little aircraft carriers with the Izumo class helicopter destroyers, which now can launch F-35Bs, which are very, very capable aircraft, especially for their sensor suite. And recently, a lot of Tomahawk missiles are headed over to Tokyo as well, which can hit any kind of Chinese ships they want to launch from their docks. So that's another significant thing. And then finally, if we could do one more thing, the significance of Korea and the recent attempted military coup, if you like.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, that is a great and interesting topic. I think for the purposes of everything we've talked about today, we could sort of simplify it and just say that the Korean Peninsula historically is often divided. And that has to do with its geography. But then especially, during the Cold War as a sort of vestige of the Cold War, it's also extremely ideologically divided. And those same factors create extreme ideological division within South Korea. Should we appease the North, or should we be hawkish toward the North? Should we reach out to the Americans and stay locked in the American alliance? But then that means being really good friends with Japan, which we don't want to do. Or should we sort of make a more pragmatic policy that's more Eurasian focused, and rely heavily on China? And all those divisions are reflected in the two, in the Democratic Party and the People Power Party in Korea. And the parties themselves have been trying to sort of strangle each other for many years. And one previous president committed suicide. Several have been put in jail. Obviously, President Park was impeached and removed just, 8 years ago. So they've had tumultuous domestic politics, and it reflects their very limited capabilities and the fact that they're scrunched between Japan and China, and they don't have nuclear weapons. But now North Korea has nuclear weapons, a defense pact with Russia, and is actually actively invading, or taking military action with Russia. So they just feel insecure. And the answer of the Democratic Party, which does have control of the assembly, is we need to hedge, because if President Trump comes in and does negotiations with Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, we don't want to be off on a limb by ourselves with Yoon trying to pick a fight with North Korea. We don't even know if the Americans will defend us in that environment, or we don't even know the Americans aren't letting us get a nuclear deterrent. So switching to the leadership of the Democratic Party enables them to hedge with the North, with Russia, with China, and that way they're not just humiliated if Trump comes in and cuts a deal with the North, or more likely cuts a deal with China, like some kind of strategic accommodation with China. So anyway, that's how I see that, and it just reflects that and for the time being, the popular tailwind is actually favoring the Democratic Party. So that's sort of the answer for now. Is an accommodationist regime will take place, and it will be also hedging against whatever the Americans do. But over the long run, it doesn't resolve anything, because South Korea still remains tumultuous, and the young people aren't just, asking to be turned into a communist satellite state. That's not really what they want in life. So as we go further down the road, we'll find out the Americans still want South Korea as an ally, and South Korea still wants America as an ally, and that will overturn whatever accommodation the Democratic Party is able to achieve in the coming years.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly based in Tokyo, teaching at one of the prestigious universities here in Tokyo, and you're seeing the younger generations of Japan and Korea absolutely coalesce around popular culture. For example, there's more and more Koreans studying in Tokyo every year, and they really like each other. In spite of the kind of the older nationalistic types who don't. I got a Korean girl in one of my classes who's like, no, my grandparents hate it, but my parents are okay with it, and I'm so happy to be here. On that note, let's just conclude then. So thank you very much. I think I would agree with you that at the moment we've got, there was a report that was issued by one of the CCP think tanks that said that it's kind of now or never for war in Taiwan. I think we agree that that's not the case. If it was the case, we'd see that development of personnel, and they wouldn't be able to hide that. So it's certainly not going to happen next year. And if it does happen, it will be down to a breakdown with Trump towards the end of his term around 2028. And yeah, you were going to say something?
Well, obviously, we've already overstayed our welcome, but the last little bit I would inject there is there, and you alluded to this earlier about creating a new reality. There's plenty of room for quasi-military or hybrid military and economic sanctions for China to pressure the regime in Taiwan and try to help build a case for the Kuomintang to continue making a comeback against a discredited president like Chung-ta. So I do think we'll see activity. And I think a lot of it will be very fishy. I would be worried about outlying islands. I would be worried about lawfare. I'd be worried about coastal operations and trade intercepts. But in terms of invasion or blockade, yeah, I think we're in agreement that that's a little bit longer of a time frame.
Yeah, we might see stuff like the Chinese and the Russians are trying to do in America, which is kind of create these or exploit these divisions within society, and that's something that they're very good at. All right, then. Thank you very much. And we'll end there. Mike. Thank you.